we had met 28 years ago. At the time, you had just come from Berkeley in 1988 and Princeton in NYU, and I used to give a joint seminar at that time. He introduced me, as I just told him, and I bet he forgot to, Lyotard, the book on conditions of postmodernity, which changed the course of my thinking and writing since then. But I also introduced him to Michel Lamont, who had done something because he says to me, look, I've kept in contact since then. Jasper is a very, very prolific writer. He has a book coming out every 2 years. He puts some of us to shame. And they're all become landmarks, especially his work on social movements, the works of emotions, and how social movements evolve and change constantly in times of social flux. The topic of his talk is also revealing, which says a lot about what he wants to tell us. The rules of the game is that how many minutes did they tell you you're going to talk, James?
I don't remember, to tell you the truth.
How?
50 minutes?
50 minutes. 50 minutes is fair, and then we leave the rest of the time for discussion. By the way, he is a visiting professor at Columbia, at Princeton, at the New School. So he is, although he was educated on the West Coast, there is an East Coast dimension to him. James, ahlan wa sahlan. And this is his first trip to Lebanon.
I will, for the sake of the cameraman, so I don't wander around. I don't think I need this, though. Do you need this? You do for the recording? Okay. It's wonderful to be here, and it's wonderful to see Samir again after all these years, and thank you all for coming today. I'll admit right at the start that the title is a bit of a fib, because I really don't know very much about the events in the Arab-speaking world over the last year and a half, but I thought that would make for a better title. And I gather this week is a bit of a festival of talks on the Arab Spring. Nonetheless, I will try a bit to get it in. The last year and a half, as everyone knows, has seen a worldwide outpouring of protest, not only in the Arab-speaking world, but also in New York and elsewhere with the occupiers, with the Indignados in Spain. And one of the things I do want to do today is try to pull together several moments of the so-called Arab Spring to try to rethink the major paradigms of research on social movements. But in doing this, I don't want us to forget, as we congratulate ourselves for living through an important moment in world history, that protest occurs every day, all around the world, and it probably always has. And most of the time, we don't even hear about it. It's not dramatic or sustained enough for the media to cover. Protest is a fundamental part of human existence. It predates, in fact, I would say, social movements by quite a long time. Nonetheless, protest changes, and our theories change with it, although a lot more slowly. So we can expect that recent events will eventually force us to think in new ways about protest. Academic theories have always advanced when politics changed. The urban working class revolutions of the 19th century gave us crowd theories. The Nazis gave us mass society theories. The US Civil Rights Movement gave us resource mobilization. Feminism and LGBTQ movements gave us cultural and identity theories. My own hunch is that the new direction will be toward better theoretical micro-foundations, in part because I think this is the direction that social movement research is already moving in. Older approaches have focused on large entities, social movements, usually at the national level, the state, usually seen as a unified strategic player, social networks that link together aggregations of individuals, and something called the environment for a social movement, which I'll come back to. We also talk about a culture, linked usually to a society, taking these words for granted as if they were real things out there. Well, it seems to me that all of these concepts need to be rethought. The structural notion of the political environment, for example. It was meant to remind us that social movements don't emerge in a vacuum, but are reactions to their contexts. Fine, except to call it an environment is to imply that it's some kind of structure that's out of our control. In fact, the environment, the context, consists of other players with their own goals, their own resources, their own capabilities, pursuing their own projects that may conflict with those of the protesters. The notion of the field, which Pierre Bourdieu has made fairly popular, it does a little better, it seems to me, since it at least arrays a bunch of players on a kind of 2x2 grid. But it shares many of the problems of structuralism by conflating players and their positions into a single system. Thank you. Instead of a field or an environment, I'd like to suggest that we begin to think about protest with a language of players and arenas in order to break the concept of field into its components, so that we can see how players pursue their goals across many arenas, switch arenas from time to time. We can take the players seriously in this way, rather than reducing them to their positions in arenas in which they operate, which I think is how the structural approach operates. The concept of a field collapses players into their arenas. So what are these micro-foundations? Briefly, because since I'm going to come back to all of this, I think we need to know more about individuals, about their emotions, their choices, their ways of thinking. Then we need to know about how individuals interact, what goes on in social networks, how persuasion and engagement take place through these networks. And notice I say persuasion rather than communication, as Jürgen Habermas would say. Persuasion comes from the grand tradition of rhetoric, which recognizes that there are a number of effects that we hope to have on others, including actions, including emotions, and not just their cognitive agreement. Now, in addition to individuals and their interactions, we need to pay more attention to decisions, to strategic dilemmas and choices. There's been a lot of interest in how, for example, individual militants move through different movements with different relationships to each one, different kinds of attachments to different organizations and movements. And of course, there has been a rediscovery of the emotions that always accompany action and the preparation for action. And this is what I really want to highlight today. What I would like most to emphasize is what I call thinking-feeling. And here the title is accurate. By this I mean the hundreds of ways that our nervous systems receive and process information, the ways in which they help us assess how things are going for us in the world. They prepare us for the actions that we might take in response. They're the solidarities, the aversions we feel, the distance we feel to the world around us. These are little processes, including things, goofy little things like our hair follicles standing, our hair standing on end, peripheral vision, subtle and not so subtle changes in our biochemistry, muscle reactions, especially muscles in our faces, but also in our guts, the innumerable nerve firings that go on. And these work their way up all the way through into conscious, even verbal processing. In fact, the conscious and verbal processing are only the final product, and sometimes don't occur at all. Sometimes we think purely at a pre-verbal, pre-conscious level. This is the rather subtle world of emotions. And I say subtle because most of our emotions are quite complex and beneath our conscious awareness. We've been misled by a 2,000-year-old tradition that contrasts emotions and rationality. Even recently, scholars concentrate too much on the dramatic emotions, such as anger and the kind of paralyzing, panicky fear, the kinds of emotions that can derail a political project or can derail our collaboration with others. These, in fact, are exceptional as emotions. Mostly we have emotional experiences that help us do what we want to do, help us process information, and help us act on it. So I use what is in fact a pretty awkward term, thinking-feeling, thinking-feeling, because it seems to me that the same or similar raw materials of sensation and recognition are used to construct relatively abstract conscious thoughts and to construct what we normally call emotions. Thinking and feeling overlap, it seems to me, much more than they differ. At least that's what I'm going to try to convince you of today. Too much sociology relies on a kind of idealism in which thought replaces thinking, products replace processes, in which we isolate frames and identities and put labels on them by ripping them out of the context in which people actually experience them and use them. We search for underlying codes or narratives. We search for the langue rather than the parole. And then we artificially contrast these thoughts that we've created or thought we found with emotions, as though our emotions, in fact, were irrational eruptions of some kind that disrupt our actions and take us away from our pure thoughts. It's yet another form of the old mind-body contrast. For 2,000 years, observers have exaggerated how disembodied our thoughts are and how irrational and arbitrary and embodied our emotions are. Emotions have been treated as automatic instincts and responses over which we have no control. Political elites, in particular, have used this contrast, have contrasted emotions and rationality, and their purpose has always been to exclude various groups from governing. Slaves, women, the working class, immigrants, the list goes on and on. They've all been dismissed as too emotional to participate, too emotional to vote, too emotional to be part of the polity. So I want to use the term thinking-feeling because even now, if I say I'm studying emotions or feelings, it's almost impossible for people in their minds not to contrast them with thinking. It's almost impossible to overcome such an old duality. In fact, I have a different view. Emotions are vital to how we think, how we evaluate, how we act, how we function in the world. In fact, in psychology, the trend of the last 2 decades has been to understand how deeply embodied cognition is, how thoughtful, wise, functional emotions, in fact, are. And I think that an acknowledgement of thinking-feeling solves some of the challenges that have accompanied the move in so many different perspectives toward a micro-level vision of politics. We see this especially in both French and American theoretical trends. We see the trend, for example, in Charles Tilly's later work. We see it in a lot of American social movement theory, which I'll come back to. We see it in France in Turren's shift from the collective subject with a capital S to individual subjects with small case S's. We see it in Bourdieu's legacy. He always talked about small things, but he always linked them, sometimes rather mysteriously, to large things, especially to social class. So even the most tiny gestures, the most tiny bodily language ended up being linked to this large thing called social class. On the other hand, his students, and his students' students, and his students' students' students, he has seemingly thousands of had seemingly thousands of students, they're able to talk about the same things directly without the preconceived macro-level boxes. We see the same thing in Bruno Latour's concern with objects, with the assembling of people and things. Processes of thinking, feeling lie beneath all of these. So in order to advance this perspective and describe it a little more, I now want to turn to 3 moments in the Arab-speaking revolutions that began last year, and contrast how older or newer ways of thinking about mobilization would understand these moments. The first was in a small town in Tunisia, where Mohamed Bouazizi set himself on fire in December 2010. It was an event so unexpected, so dramatic, that people had to pay attention to it. Self-immolation is not a standard protest tactic in the Arab-speaking world, except apparently in Algeria, where it turns out there is something of a tradition of that. Or at least it was uncommon before Bouazizi. It has since spread like these tactics do. Bouazizi was made into a symbol of frustration, of indignation, and his action encouraged others to display their own anger. But there's an important disjuncture between Bouazizi as a player, making certain choices for his own purposes, and Bouazizi as a symbol used for other people's purposes. Once he's dead, he can only be a symbol. He's no longer a player who makes decisions, who follows strategies. And this, I think, is typical of individuals and how we should think about them. They have these 2 sides. They make choices that matter, and they are endowed with meaning by others. Although, while they're alive at least, they can also control their own symbolism to some extent. In this case, as in many cases, I think there's a wide gap between Bouazizi, the symbol, and as a decision maker. Some of his anger was at being slapped. The story, at least, I hear there's some doubts about it, the story, at least, is that he was slapped by a woman, which was a source of deep shame for him, on top of other sources of shame, especially the shame of not being able to make a decent living, selling fruits and vegetables. It's not clear if his first intentions were very political at all, but they were strategic, they were purposive, and they were emotional. The story, as I understand it, is that he was asserting his honor, asserting his dignity. So after he had been slapped, in what seems to have been a kind of standard corrupt shakedown for money, he complained to the governor of the town and was rebuffed. So on top of his initial humiliation as a man, he had the added distinct grievance that his own government was unable or unwilling to process his complaint in any way. This is more political, of course, and in fact it's quite common. People can grow more indignant over bad procedures for addressing their complaints than they do over the initial complaints. Not always, but sometimes. The blame shifts to the state more generally, and in fact, more explosively. So within an hour of the incident, Bouazizi had set himself on fire in a kind of apparently unpremeditated fury of humiliation and anger. As I said, he may not have had much premeditation, but he did have, I think, purpose. And his strong emotions in this case pushed him toward that purpose. Now, the sociology of shame, the sociology of honor have faded quite a bit in recent years. I'm not sure we could say they even exist anymore. They've been overwhelmed in our models of human nature, of human motivation, by more material motives, it seems to me. But they're still highly influential in social life, even in today's supposedly modern world. So current explanations of protest may have room for Bouazizi, the symbol, taken up and broadcast by others, but certainly not for Bouazizi, the individual, making decisions with his own projects and priorities. And yet, of course, without the individual, we would never have the symbol. So first of all, we need models that can include both individuals as players and the more traditional groups as strategic players. But at the same time, we need to recognize that these are not the same. We need to understand how groups and individuals interact with each other, how individuals can be symbols of and for a group, and they can, of course, help make decisions within the group. We need to find a way to incorporate both processes, and both deeply involve emotions. Okay, the second moment I'd like to look at is that of the increasing crowds that gathered in Tahrir Square in Cairo the month after Bouazizi's self-immolation. At first, of course, in a very familiar way, they faced considerable intimidation, armed battles from time to time with the police, but their sheer numbers gradually gave them more and more safety, some safety. They were helped at a certain point, by a strategic decision by the army, a decision that I think could have gone the other way very easily, but was a conscious, calculated choice that somebody somewhere in the army made. So, like Bouazizi's self-immolation, here was a moment that could never have been predicted, or at least not predicted from the macro level of environments and context. Within certain broad constraints laid down perhaps by big structures, there are always strategic decisions to make on all sides. And I say all sides rather than both sides, because there are always more than two players. If for no other reason, then that a strategic player can always break down, or at least be broken down analytically, into sub-players. There can be a conflict within a player, so that a player, in fact, is an arena as well as a player, an arena for conflict. Well, we'd like to understand why the crowd swelled in Cairo and elsewhere, but especially in Tahrir Square. And one traditional answer would be simply that people calculated that they were less likely to be attacked and harmed. Certainly true. This weighing of costs and benefits is the heart of rational choice theory from microeconomics, but it's also there in what's known as political opportunity theory of Charles Tilly and others. That's still dominates perhaps American social movement theory. But alongside that model, I think we clearly need another. Egyptians wanted to be part of history. They wanted to feel that thrill, that deep satisfaction of having an impact on the world, of doing something that they would be proud to tell their grandchildren about. This is a set of emotions that have not been very well described yet. It's a combination of curiosity, of excitement, and of a very deep moral satisfaction. It seems to me when you see people bringing their children to a demonstration or an encampment, there's got to be more to it than a calculation that their children are not going to be harmed. There are various satisfactions of belonging to a group, of identification with a nation or a movement, as well as some sense of history, a sense that something new is being created, something new is being founded. Protest becomes a celebration. It's no longer meant solely to overthrow a regime, but to experience and establish a new world. It's not merely the joy of being in a crowd with its various pleasures, but of the joy of being in a crowd that's making history, which is a very different thing and a much deeper, more moral set of emotions. The third experience I'd like to mention is the civil war that overthrew Gaddafi in Libya. And same kind of civil war is going on right next door right now. It had been a central tenet of social movement theory, again developed especially by Tilly, that strong repression always ends protest, period. And in fact, in most cases, this is absolutely true. But there's been a growing recognition over the last decade, I would say, that violent repression sometimes increases mobilization instead of decreasing it. Now, given the structural and fairly rationalistic biases of the field, this has been a great puzzle to it. How do we explain these two opposite results? When the costs of protesting go up dramatically, how can there be more of it? Well, again, it seems that emotions are a key part of our explanation, have to be. The self-sacrifice that open warfare demands, especially by those not trained in warfare, is really almost beyond belief. It's, to me at least, almost unimaginable. For people to engage in combat without extensive military training requires a number of emotions. Humiliation, for one, especially as we see this with Palestinians living in the West Bank and Gaza, the sort of daily humiliations inflicted on them, I think have become a deep part of their human motivation. And the restoration of honor through vengeance is certainly one of the oldest of human motivations. There's also a moral anger, indignation, outrage over how the regime is treating its people. As I mentioned, the indignation that arises over bad process when your own government is doing things, bad reactions by the state, such as violent repression, can be as strong as that over any original grievance, and is certainly more of a strategic interaction. There's also the management of fear that normal people develop in fighting, in any kind of fighting. We know something about the management of fear in more, almost hate to say mundane protest events, many of which are severely repressed. So fear is common in these, and fear has to be managed constantly during demonstrations. In some ways, the passivity of being attacked by police when one protests is, in some ways, worse than active engagement in combat, when, in a way, it's a relief not to be passive anymore. As frightening as warfare, as combat is, it can feel good after a long period of tense fear and waiting. It can come as a relief, as a kind of release of tensions. Let me mention another aspect of the transition from peaceful protest to outright battle. Most scholars of protest, almost all in fact, admire nonviolence. Naturally enough, who wouldn't prefer nonviolent means? It's certainly a good thing in and of itself, and there's a whole long, admirable philosophy behind nonviolence. But it's easy to forget the trade-offs and the dilemmas of nonviolence. There's a strategic dilemma that I call, perhaps too flippantly, naughty or nice. The only way to attain certain goals is by using means that are generally disapproved of, whether by the public, by authorities, even by your own movement or your own team. So there will be a cost to using those more aggressive tactics, either in increased repression or at least in the form of disapproval, perhaps even the demoralization of your own group, or parts of it, perhaps the fissioning of your own group, splitting up of it. So the aggressive, the naughty strategic choice makes sense only in special circumstances. When there's a risk that you will be eliminated otherwise if you don't fight back aggressively, or when there's some specific advantage to be gained that's permanent and irreversible and can only be gained through aggressive means. A revolution is a very good example, but there are others in protest. Riots that lead to new legislation, violent strikes that lead to recognition for a union, and so on. I mention this because I want to suggest that emotions are not the only important micro-foundation. Strategic dilemmas, choice points, and the choices made at different choice points also matter enormously. And we don't understand these very well either at the macro level when we take this structural view. We need to grasp particular individuals, thinking about the choices ahead of them, wrestling with them, often in conflict with their partners, using whatever memories, whatever cognitive heuristics, whatever emotions they can bring to bear on these choices. As long as there's some choice, there's going to be some agency, which I think is very important in our models to balance the structure. So let me back up and talk a little more about the theoretical shift that we need in order to understand these moments better. A shift that I think is already underway. The clock should really be back there, not up here where you all are watching it constantly and I can't see it. In the U.S., the usual way to think about Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, and so on, as I said, what is known as political opportunity theory, would be to assume that there's always plenty of discontent out there, so that protesters really only need some opening, some window of opportunity, some sense that they won't be slaughtered if they go out into the streets, as well as a sense that they might actually win. Although these are not the same things. They're a sense of how much repression you face and whether you will win. They're connected, but they're not exactly the same. Sometimes people protest simply as an assertion of their own dignity as human beings, even if they think they have very little chance of winning. Doug McAdam called this kind of calculus cognitive liberation, and it was highly cognitive. It was a calculation that would be at home in rational choice theories, rational choice models. The will is there, only the means to protest are lacking. People are assumed to be fairly calculating, certainly rational, and motivated largely by their political and economic interests. It's a tradition that's been very important for the last 30 years. It owes a lot to Marxist class theory, but oddly, it's also compatible with rational choice theory. And like the theories I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, it was developed with one particular exemplar in mind, especially as Tilly developed it, namely the labor movements of Britain and France, and especially in the 19th century. Political opportunity theory was crafted to deal with these kinds of repressive settings, but settings in which there was some promise, at least, of democracy. So there was a parliament that was emerging, but was still a bit of a sham. There were lots of people who were excluded from voting, so it wasn't representative of the entire population. So in a way, this model should apply fairly well to some of these recent cases in the Arab-speaking world. And there is a lot of truth to the model. As I said, severe repression usually does curtail protest. But there are also weaknesses, as I said, especially the fact that repression often increases mobilization, when a careful calculation or rational calculation would lead in the other direction. In fact, an increase in mobilization is a very common response to repression. More anger, more indignation, more protest. And it seems to me that the events in Syria over the past year are the most striking refutation of the entire structural opportunity model that you could imagine. The model's problem is the assumption that protest happens automatically whenever there's an opening, without any attention to the social dynamics of human motivation or, in a word, emotions. Okay. So let me summarize again what I hope the emerging vision of protest has and will take away from the last year and a half of protest. It has to be strategic and interactive, meaning that we need to define players. We need to look carefully at who is doing what and desiring what. And this includes the creation of new players based on shared interests, shared morals, shared visions, shared emotions. It's not just the tracing of existing players based on material interests. Then we need to watch the players as they engage each other. We need to observe, in this case, not just the protesters, but the police, armies, international observers, courts, journalists, editors, potential allies, opponents, even, as this country knows very well, foreign governments and foreign armies, not just your own. And when we see them interact in various arenas, we can work back up from there to the structures. And we'll understand the structures, or what are called structures, better in this way. We'll understand them better than if we begin with the structures and deduce what social movements must be, what social movements must want, what social movements must be doing, what function they're performing, which is the traditional fallacy of the structural vision. If we start with a theory of history, a theory of society, a theory of the civil sphere, then we'll never be able to observe real protesters and real acts of resistance. We also need to be cultural, to acknowledge and understand how meanings are created and contested. the different carriers of meaning, both literal physical carriers, like posters or the human voice, and more metaphorical characters, whether those are narratives, identities, frames, and so on. We live in an interpreted world. Players are always audiences for each other's actions as much as anything else. But I'd like to say that the cultural approaches which have become the main contender for, or the main competitor of the structural approaches, cultural approaches have missed something crucial. Because virtually everything that cultural social scientists study has its causal impact because of the emotions involved, not merely because they make our neat cognitive grids. Meaning emerges partly through our feelings, as I said, not just through our codes. And it's time to replace the entire model of the brain as a computer, doing calculations based on codes the way computers do, in favor of a more sensitive nervous system with multiple sensibilities, multiple sensitivities, a feeling brain rather than a calculating brain. Okay. Which gets me back, of course, to emotions. Emotions have always been a kind of gestalt test for generations of scholars of social movements and protest. To the crowd theorists of the 19th century through the collective behavior generation of the 1950s, emotions were proof that protesters were irrational. Emotions were always described as strong emotions. There were never mild emotions. They were always strong emotions. They were always, in fact, anger and fear. They always made people, protesters, do irrational things. For the structural paradigm that followed beginning in the late 60s, emotions still would have proven that protesters are irrational. So emotions now, because the structural paradigm was more sympathetic, emotions had to be denied, they had to be ignored, they had to be repressed. The cultural turn of social movement theory in the 80s and 90s gave a lot of attention to showing that codes, frames, and so on mattered. Emotions were just a step too far. They were just too soft, as though they would discredit the whole cultural project. So even since the cultural shift, people still tend to say, don't emotions make us do irrational things? That's, I'm sure, in the heads of all of you. Let me just note that no one ever asked us of other building blocks of social movements, other building blocks of action. People don't usually ask, don't frames make us act irrationally? Don't narratives make us act irrationally? Don't resources make us irrational? Don't political opportunities lead us to do dumb things? Now, maybe we should ask these questions more often about these other entities, but I think, should ask them less often about emotions, because the answer is no. Most of the time, emotions do not make us irrational. To the contrary, they provide the ends and the means without which there would be no rational action or any other kind of action. So what I want to do now is take a few minutes to lay out several different ways in which emotions are relevant to political action, and then to ask, do they imply that emotions are most likely to derail political action? Because, as I said, one way to address the old idea that emotions mean irrationality is to show how small a subset of emotions that really entails, we're really talking about. I'm not going to argue that emotions never lead us to mistakes. I'm not even going to say that they never lead to irrationality, only that this is extremely unusual, which is lucky since all human action is permeated by emotions, pretty much everything we do. So it's a relief to know we're not acting irrationally all day, every day. Let's accept that political action has purpose, or purposes, plural, because in any political activity, there are always many goals at work. And that means that emotions can be relevant to either means or to ends. In the realm of ends, we have affective loyalties to groups and to individuals. We want a collective, a group, to benefit from our action, whether it's a nation, whether it's a class, whether it's the category of people, such as all women that the movement claims to speak for. We may also hate, so that in fact it's directly satisfying to us when some identifiable group suffers in some way. sad but true. In most of these cases of long-term affective commitments, emotions deeply affect the ends of action, our ends of action, if in fact they are not ends in themselves. Our goal is to help our friends or those we identify with, and to harm our enemies. The ancient Greeks talked about this. These are among the oldest goals of politics. We can, as I said, we can be horrified by some of these ends. We can identify deep costs to those who pursue some of them. We can even say they're based on misunderstandings of the in-group and the out-group. But it's hard to say of any given end that it's simply irrational, except perhaps on a Freudian model of internal dynamics that undermine our functioning in relationship to our external environment. But even in the Freudian case, emotions are our emotional goals are a kind of internal psychic management, which is a far cry from even caring about helping our friends and harming our enemies. So for the most part, affective solidarities are how we feel about our environment, why we care about our environment, why we want to act on it, in it at all. Okay, emotions also affect our means of action. Moods like resignation, cynicism, depression curtail our ability to act. Moods such as optimism, enthusiasm, confidence encourage more action. Our quick reflex emotions, here I include anger and fear, affect our means even more directly. Fear can paralyze us. At other times it launches us into action, depending on how we frame that fear. Anger also often triggers action to redress some perceived wrong very often. Now, as I said, when we have fear and anger as our main examples of emotions, we tend to exaggerate the potential irrationality of emotions. Since these reflex emotions are so quick, they're quick to appear and usually quick to subside. And yet those are the paradigm emotions that we think about when we think about emotions in politics. One more comment about means and ends. There's a kind of asymmetry to political emotions. My emotions are mostly ends for me. They are what I care about. I directly feel pleasure or pain through those emotions. But when I try to arouse emotions in you as an audience, your emotions are mostly means for me, for some end that I have. I want you to feel, I want you to believe, I want you to act in some way that's going to advance my goals. Okay. All right. Let me skip over a bit here. Sensing a mood of, well, I'm not sure what I won't even say it. It seems to me there are two main kinds of potential that emotions have for helping us do something that disrupts action. One is that an individual can be taken away briefly from a collective project into emotions that perhaps make her feel good at the moment as an individual without regard to the others. I call this the disruption potential of emotions. I can be off on some emotional trajectory that feels great to me, but in fact undermines the crowd, undermines the march, undermines the collective project. The second way is that an individual does something in the short run that disrupts her own long-term projects. And this we can think of as regret potential. Right? The person herself is going to regret it at a certain point, regret having done something. Now, the regret, of course, is a subset of disruption in that we're disrupting our own plans and projects. But they're very different in how they work, these emotions. And I think these are really the two ways that emotions derail, disrupt, lead to regret, and so on. But again, I think it's best to describe the trade-offs and the dilemmas of emotions without pretending that we can resolve them, without pretending that there's one right answer. We should have these emotions and not these emotions. We need to lay out the costs of various emotions to see how high they are. Then we should be able to get to a point where we could say in some cases, well, these costs seem awfully high. The payoff seems awfully low. Then, if the people we as sociologists and social scientists, people we are studying can't tell us why our calculations are wrong and explain to us, well, no, there is this other payoff here that we've missed. No, the costs are not so high of acting this way. If they can't do that, and especially if they're willing to say, yes, you're right, the cost was too high, but I can't help myself, or I couldn't help myself. In that case, we can say, I think, well, there's something either deeply mistaken or irrational going on here. You can't help yourself is the key, I think. This was the old image of emotions as something that overpowered us, that came from inside some mysterious place and made us do strange things. But I hope that I've shown a little bit, suggested a little bit about why this is in fact rare. I haven't even mentioned the most obvious, which is we make far more mistakes out of misinformation and cognition than we do from emotions. Emotions are the key, in fact, the key micro-foundation of political action. Because in a way what they do is link us to a series of contexts. Urges like lust link us to our own bodies. Reflex emotions like anger link us to events in our immediate physical environment. Long-term affects such as love and hate link us or animate our relations to a broad social environment, symbolic as well as physical. Moral emotions such as shame and pride also relate us to a very broad social symbolic world. Moods, finally, either energize or otherwise color all of these connections. Emotions, again, show us why we should care enough about the world to act in it, to engage in political action at all. Emotions connect us thoroughly with the various worlds that we're a part of. They're about action in context, in the pragmatist sense. This is why emotions especially promise a fundamental rethinking of human action, overcoming old dualisms of structure versus action, rational versus irrational, that have misled us for so long. Now, it seems to me these new micro-foundations that we're already interested in, I think, solve both intellectual and political problems. I've been trying to show the analytic advantages, filling in some of the gaps in the big structural paradigms that have become so obvious. But a lot of scholars are also politically motivated. And if they have long memories, very long memories, they'll think back to the theories of, before the structural paradigm, the theories of crowds and the theories of collective behavior, which deployed a lot of psychological terms to simply dismiss protesters as infantile, as immature, as misguided, as naive, or simply just screwed up. Emotions were especially thought to negate any claim to serious politics. But what do we owe the people we study, if not honesty, if not the truth about why they do what they do, what the causes of action are? We owe them, I think, as part of this, we owe them respect. And what better way to respect them than to start from where they start, to get inside their heads, to appreciate their passions, their goals, their frustrations. In other words, to treat them like complex human beings, just like us. The problem with the old theories was not that they turned to psychology, it was that they got the psychology wrong. And I think we owe it to protesters to try to get it right. So just as citizens are sometimes in a mood for change, we might say, so scholars are sometimes in a mood for intellectual change. Thomas Kuhn pointed out a long time ago that this is often the result of dissatisfaction on the part of young scholars with the older paradigms. For a long time I convinced myself I was one of those younger scholars, and I can't really do that anymore. But my hope is that there are young scholars out there dissatisfied with the structural paradigms. But the paradigm shift is also a reflection of what's happening in the non-academic world, the world of politics and protest. And so I hope that these two forces together are driving or will drive a major overhaul of our theories of protest. We owe that much, at least, to the real protesters who've given their lives in the last year and a half to bring about changes in their own lives
but also in ours. Thank you.
Now's your chance to leave if you need to before questions start, and I'll take. First of all, I always like to start with a student rather than a faculty member, or if I can, one or two. Anybody here without an advanced degree who wants to ask a question?
But I think that gentleman back there had something very urgent to say, so he can go before me if that's okay with you, Dr. Jasper.
Very gentle. Yes.
Sir.
Microphone.
So I guess you have to come up here to ask questions.
No. Is there a microphone somewhere?
Dear. Please, I am Dr. Hussein Abu Namid. I am a Palestinian. And I come to here for you because you are a professor from New York. I hear you, and I am going to hear others also. But you speak about social problems, and you speak about Bouazizi. Your key point was the insult of an individual, which is Abu Azizi. But I am astonished that you don't speak about the insult of all the Tunisians. It is not the insult only of Abu Azizi. It is the insult of Tunisia. And the results say that there is a big problem which is more than Bouazizi. So the first point, it is to how to see the insult of the general, the nation, the society, not only Bouazizi. I have to ask you, why you speak about social? Do not speak about politics. I know very well that everything we have to think to social, but as a friend, as a fellow for you, I say that you cannot, and you are unable to understand what is happening and going, except you have to speak about the Arab policy. So, I have to be honest with you to say that you forget that that all of your speech, I do not hear anything about the Arab-Israeli struggle. Second, I want to ask you, is what happened, politics or social? And if it's social, with what meaning? Does it because the people are poor? If you are going to say that is the problem of poverty, I have to say to you that Tunisia is the best economy in the Arabic world, except Gulf and oil countries. So, please, my fellow, if you agree to be your fellow, it is that the problem and insult of a individual, it is the insult of a nation and the whole society. It is not social issue, it is an issue of honor, identity, karama, dignity. So, also as a friend, I hope to think about, can you understand the Arabs, all the Arabs, if you do not go through the door of that what the West and Israel do thus, our blood is on the ground. You speak about the all, but you don't speak about the Palestinians. They say that there's no more Palestinian issue. But I want to say for you, as a professor and as a fellow, that Palestine is in all the hearts of all. They may not speak not for and forget it for a while, not, but Palestine is the main point in the Middle East. Last,
Excuse me,
I forget. I finished only one last point. I want to tell you as a friend that now I am with the Arab Spring. I am against tyranny. I feel that democracy leads to everything, even the liberation of Palestine. But what I want to say that anybody which tried to struck the Arab Spring, he say, oh, those of Arab Spring are factored in from USA. That what I want from this point to say, that they try to speak about the deep hate which is in the area for political causes. So I am very sorry that I take your time, but I want to be honest with you as a professor, and if I leave, please, because I have an appointment in this time. Okay. If you answer me since 5 minutes, I may stay. If not, please let me, I have to go because I have an appointment at 6.
Wow. Okay, well, I'll try to give you a brief answer. I think what you raise is a very interesting question, which is why do individuals sometimes identify with the group so that the dignity of the group, the honor of that group, becomes the most important thing for them? I think it's one of the most interesting questions we can ask as sociologists, because sometimes it happens and sometimes it doesn't. People are willing to die for the dignity of that group. Now, it seems to me what we need to understand is the emotional processes by which that identification takes place. And you point to a very obvious set of circumstances which I mentioned here, which is humiliation, right? Forget the small indignities of electricity going off. There are big indignities, and certainly the Palestinians have suffered humiliation that is really, again, beyond belief. So it seems to me that those kinds of actions by, an explicit policy really by the Israeli government to humiliate Palestinians who are still living in the territories, in the occupied territories, it seems to me that is one of the kinds of processes, one of the kinds of mechanisms by which you get a strong identification with the group, because it's not just you personally being tortured, humiliated, killed, people in your family, but it's the group. And it seems to me that government policy and some sort of legal repression or denial of rights is one of the most common sources of this kind of collective identity. Bouazizi, I think, was not responding in that way. For him, it was a personal form of humiliation. It became the symbol. He became a symbol of a group. He became a symbol of a corrupt government. But that wasn't his doing. So that's why I said I think it's important for us to understand both the individual and, in this case, his point of view, and the group, and why the group can become a symbol. That's why, to me, I wouldn't distinguish the social and the political. The political is social, always. And you mentioned, well, it's not about poverty. No, it's never about poverty. That's why dignity, that's why insult are so important, honor. The poorest people in the world will organize themselves in reaction to an insult faster than they will organize themselves to try to get out of poverty. So I think you're exactly right about that. I mean, it's not about the economic issues. That's one of the reasons I think that this whole last year and a half will help us understand issues such as dignity, issues such as shame better. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you very much. Really, I have
Thank you.
That's what I say. We need peace, we need democracy, but also we need justice. Peace is not enough. The justice is very, very necessary. And I'm sorry because I take your time, okay? Thank you. الصديق اللي أعطاني وقته. Yeah.
I can agree with you about the importance of justice.
Michael, since you are a student, could you
Yeah.
respond to,
Anyway, thank you for the talk. I really, really enjoyed it. And so especially somebody that also is within the realm of sociology of emotions. I really appreciate the goodwill that you're, the good connotations that you're ascribing to emotions when they're usually kind of looked at as negative. The first question that I had is about, you were talking about rationality. It was, I think, one of the first points you were making about the role of emotion in protest movements. And the first one is, who gets to, I feel like we have this idea that that rationality is objectified. So we say that this is what rationality is, or a group of people or a political motivator gets to say that this is what rationality is. And so thus anything that opposes this is irrational. And so emotion in this sense would be irrational for whatever reason that this overarching system says, dictates or whatever. Well, the question that was going through my head though is that isn't it rational, for instance, in Egypt, for somebody to, or a group of people, to siphon billions of dollars from the people? Isn't it a rational response that anger and frustration would come out of that? I mean, and I guess what I'm saying, it's not so much a question, but it's more of a, I guess, trying to give more meat to your argument, and that is that it seems to me that emotion is rational if injustice is is occurring within a group or within a certain situation. And then the other, and once again, kind of questioning where value comes from. I had a kind of a thought about the naughty versus nice dichotomy that you came up with, and without wanting to reduce it too much, it sounded a bit like it had some kind of resonance of utilitarianism to it. That is, that the ends versus the means. And what I thought of is that emotion, at least to me, is inherently connected to value judgment. So, and it depends on, and speaking of social movements or social movement theory, depending on whether you are the actor opposing the larger force, that you're obviously going to have a different value judgment on your emotion and on your why you're doing it, why you're doing, as opposed to what you're opposing. So, I guess what I wanted to know is, so what is purposefully aggressive to one? You had mentioned this, that why is it, like, who determines if action is positive and or if it's justified? Does that make sense? I'm sorry if that was very all over the place.
Definitely. I mean, you're right about the problematic of means and ends, and there are all sorts of ways in which emotions can blur means and ends, because you have emotions that engage you in action. You have feelings while you're doing things, that may are means to an external end, but in fact, there are satisfactions, there are ends within the means, and emotions help us, I think, understand that blurring. But that doesn't mean that we should give up on means and ends just because sometimes they overlap and blur, I think. But you're right that emotions are implicated in that, I think. The question about corruption, well, sure, I guess it's rational in a certain. It's rational in the sense that it's materially self-interested to try to overthrow a corrupt government that's siphoning money off for their own purposes and out of the country. But I don't think that's why. I think the reason why people are angry about it is more, the injustice. They're framing this as an insult, right? Because even though it was $10 billion or whatever, at some point, where do you say, well, Egyptians could have tolerated if it was $1 million. They could have tolerated if it was $1 billion. They could have tolerated if it was 5 million. There's no particular point at which you can say, oh, well, now it's such a large amount of money, now they're going to do something about it and stop it.
Right.
And I think it's really having to do with a lot with framing the blame.
Yes. Marwan, would you like to have a question?
Yes, a very quick question. First, thank you for the lecture. One of the things, I mean, it was music to my ears, the importance of emotion and all that. But one of the things that I wanted to ask you about is the association in social thought, that, you know, the dichotomy between reason and emotion. So, you know, from Aristotle to Descartes, Dewey, Habermas, you know, some of the people you mentioned, there's somehow a focus, sometimes explicit, sometimes implicit, on words and language as the tools of rationality, as opposed to images, which are associated with, you know, iconoclasm, right? The notion that images somehow appeal to the emotions, and therefore they're not, they don't belong in public deliberation, so to speak. What do you think of this? And in light of all the talk about, you know, images and art and cartoons in the uprisings, it seems there's an opportunity to perhaps look more profoundly at the role of images and connect them to emotions. And I'm wondering what if you could elaborate in your own work, you know, to what extent you think images are or are not important when you discuss emotions.
Well, that question is music to my ears because, in fact, I'm working on a book now that tries to show how we arouse emotions through images. In particular, I'm looking at images of heroes, villains, and victims, and the kinds of images that very quickly give us an appreciation of those classic character types. And I think those characters are important because they tell us what emotions we're supposed to feel. Right? We're supposed to be afraid of the villain, maybe indignant about the villain. We're supposed to pity the victims. We are supposed to admire the heroes. We don't have to like heroes, but we have to admire them and want them to help us, maybe be on their side. And I think actually that images get these kinds of things across much more immediately and in some ways profoundly than words. Yet, as you're saying, and it fits with what I was saying, I think about sort of cultural approaches, they're very, I'll say, maybe French-oriented or French-influenced, right? So, you know, they're sort of semiotic still, and I think the narratives, the frames, we have this image that they can be laid out in codes, very much on the model of language, right? That you can have a dictionary of codes, you can have a dictionary of frames, and it's a very abstract, it's a very Olympian, Cartesian, distanced view of why meanings really matter to us. And in a way, I think it reflects a lack of understanding of what meaning is. Even though culture is defined as being about meaning, very rarely do cultural sociologists tell us what meaning really is. It's sort of, that's kind of the bedrock, you don't need to explain it. And I think this is a very common phenomenon that a paradigm has at its core some metaphor or some image that has to be unexplained. And now I'm sounding a little Derridean myself, I know, a little French. But when you think about resource mobilization theories, well, they were very bad at saying what resources really were. Political opportunity theories, really very bad at telling us what political opportunities really are. Cultural theories really are not very good at telling us what meaning is. And I think if we're interested in social action itself and why people do what they do, that meaning really is primarily about how we feel. Again, thinking, feeling, you know, being closely connected. But and I think, you know, when we look at an image, it comes to us very quickly. We feel in this very gut way. We process the information in that image through all sorts of ways in our body that may or may not be conscious.
So perhaps aesthetics rather than semiotics.
Yeah, that's a fair way. Or rhetoric, perhaps, as well. Although that is also mostly about words. I like to think that you can apply rhetoric to images as well, rhetorical analysis.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
I have a few questions. Feel free to answer whatever you have responses to. The first is my former colleague, William Connolly, wrote a book, Neuropolitics. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, but he sort of dipped into certain strands of neuroscience to make certain claims. So I was wondering, with your approach, to what degree does it rely or have a relationship or see a relationship to biology, neuroscience? The second question is, my field is international relations. You know, to what degree, like, what would you say to people who are used to, studying, states and larger macro processes for your approach? Some people look into sort of cognitive psychology and try to look at decision makers and leaders, but would you offer something that's more broader, that's looking, at society, communities? And the third point, the third is a more particular question. It's more about methodology. If you're, and sorry I missed the beginning of your talk, I had a meeting, but when you talk about Azizi or anybody, like basically, how do you know what their emotions are, the feelings? How much, as a researcher, especially if you're coming from sociology, what are you looking at? I mean, you just talked about looking at images, but then is it how people read images? How do you know how they're feeling? How would you do research on a culture and a context that maybe you don't know all the language or even know the nuances of expression? It seems like you're relying on people's expressions. So how do you do something that's not just doing discourse analysis, that's actually, how do you read, especially for people who are new to this kind of approach, how do you point out sort of the method of going in this direction?
Can I just add to that? Because the data that you cite had to come through Western media, right? And you've shown us how Western political analysis and media already uses these grids of emotion versus ration. So the data would already come packaged for you in those two. How would you then be able to get back and rethink outside of those categories, to rethink what emotion would mean, or if pull something out? It seems that your categories are predetermining what you can do, and sort of maybe instead of giving us something new, you're just sort of changing the relationship of X to Y. You're saying let's bring back in Y or something. It is to me as an anthropologist an extreme methodological problem.
Yeah. And anthropology is full of extreme methodological problems, so you know what you're talking about. Well, obviously our concepts always frame what we can see in a way, right? So I think in this case, my conceptual framework is somewhat different from the normal media framework. So that already, I think, gives me an ability to question some of the media presentation. But I think the methodological issues are as follows. I don't think that there is any more of a difficulty understanding people's emotions methodologically than to understand their cognition, than to understand anything else about culture, right? We have the same problems. Some of it is publicly expressed, some of it is not. Some of what's publicly expressed is expressed honestly, and some of it's manipulated. When people respond to a survey question, an attitudinal survey, we have the same problem. In fact, I would say that for some emotions, they're actually harder to hide than ideas and opinions. When I can look at you. Actually, it's hard to read your emotions too. But I could tell if you looked a little bored. You look a little skeptical now.
This requires being in front of. This requires
face to face. Yeah. Well, one of the big pushes to the sociology of emotions in last decade or two has been the presence of a lot of videotape of people doing things in public, of protesters, of people in stores doing all sorts of things that you can then go over. You can not only go over, but you can slow it down because a lot of emotions are expressed very quickly and then replaced by a sort of polite smile. And so that actually has been a big boost to the sociology of emotions. Now, that's a method that didn't exist 20 years ago, really, or not much, of everyday life. So, but again, if we can understand social life at all, how do we understand it? We understand it because we're participants in it, and we know what it is to have an emotion, we know what it is to be angry, and we know what it is to feel insulted and all these things. We understand it by observing others and talking to others, questioning them about what they were feeling, sometimes retroactively, say retrospectively, with the visual metaphor, but so after the fact. These are the ways that we do work in social science, and I don't think emotions are any more difficult. In a way, emotions, precisely because of the neuroscience of it, are more clearly things than almost anything we study as social scientists. They're more clearly observable things than community or cultural meanings or a nation or anything like that, right? There are physical markers. Now, the neurology is imperfect. And the neurology, to go back to your first question, 10, 20 years ago, neurologists basically implied or said, as we get these better brain scans, we're going to be able to tell you, well, this is where anger is, and this is where fear is. And we'll be able to pinpoint these parts of the brain. And they seem to be doing a good job. They called it the limbic system. Remember that kind of language about the brain, a certain part of the brain, and then it was evolved from reptiles. And in fact, as they've done a better job of brain scans, they have found that any emotion, in fact, lights up dozens of parts of the brain, and they interact, and a whole bunch of things are going on in the brain. And so, in a way, they've kind of empirically knocked the legs out from under their own project of mapping the brain, which to me means that to get at emotions, we really are better off, or not better off because they do different things, but we need those cultural labels for emotions. Because in a way, the dozens of things that are happening in my body and brain when I have an emotion are also affected by the label I put on it. If I decide I'm angry or if I decide I'm afraid, then the various firings in my brain, in fact, change somewhat to reflect that. So you can't give up culture in favor of neurology. That doesn't really make sense, right? We need them both to understand emotions. You certainly don't want to say anything that's going to be disproved, that's been disproved by neurologists, and it's fine for them to do what they do. But when it comes to the emotions of politics, I want to have various kinds of face-to-face observations or any kind of information. Now you did, IR. It seems to me that if you really want to understand IR, you've got to break down nations as players, right? Nations don't do things any more than social movements do things. You want to know, well, what is President Obama thinking when he makes a decision? You really want to know what people on his staff are thinking. You want to know what somebody in the army, some commander in Afghanistan, what emotions they're having, what's going through their heads, because that's going to have ramifications. So you have to have these individuals as decision makers in there. And IR, as you pointed out, is much too focused on leaders. And leaders is a terrible term because it has all this business school aura of leadership and this charisma and everything. But individuals are important. I'd rather talk about individuals because it's not necessarily the visible leaders, the recognized leaders who have an influence. It's some guy in some little force out in the mountains of Afghanistan who makes a decision that tumbles onward and other people have to respond to it. But let's also not forget that a huge amount of IR, a huge amount of diplomacy, still takes place face-to-face with individuals. It doesn't take place in some mediated world, really. It's still face-to-face, and those face-to-face interactions are filled with emotions. You put any people together face-to-face in a room, and there are all sorts of responses, reactions. Now, they're hard to get at, but then their thoughts are hard to get at, too. So,
Are emotions individuals? Yeah. Or do people feel emotions as a group?
I think only individuals feel emotions. They're affected by the group, and emotions can be contagious. You see one person yawning, pretty much pretty soon everybody's yawning, or a couple people look angry. I mean, there was this kernel of truth to crowd theories, which put a lot of emphasis on this contagion. Everybody gets angry and they're suddenly out of control. I mean, there's something to that. But again, a nation doesn't feel, we feel an emotion on behalf of our group. I can be, that guy could be insulted as a Palestinian, but that doesn't mean that all Palestinians everywhere feel the same thing.
Sam, you got a question?
Thanks for this. I just continuing. I might have missed a few things, so because of my deafness, but I'm just interested in how you think collective and individual emotion, and whether you think something Durkheimian applies to it. Like in Anthropology, there has been a lot of literature on colonial government of moods. And the notion of mood, sort of like, despite the fact that colonialism was done in the name of rationality, it was shown that the colonists had a good flair for trying to judge what was the mood of the crowd and how to govern the moods and link in collective emotion with governmentality. And so my question seemed to be locating emotions in a physicalist, biological or physiological sense in brain, etc. And then, which I'm sure individual emotions are to a certain extent, but then if we are going to speak of collective emotions, what are they, and where are they located? I mean, like in Elias Canetti's work on crowds, for instance, he talks about contagion, etc., but he seems to have a kind of like sui generis ontology of emotions, which...
I think it's possible, two things at the same time. Obviously, we have an elaborate physiology of emotions and a physiological apparatus. But that doesn't mean that emotions aren't social, right? We don't just sit here isolated and have emotions. We have emotions through interactions with the various worlds around us. Mostly, that's the social world, right, of various kinds. It can also be the physical world. I can walk out the door and be startled by something. But for the most part, emotions come out of our context, and they relate us to that context. They keep us alert to that context in ways we're not even aware of. So certainly it's possible to affect people's emotions, and that's what Durkheim is all about with his collective effervescence. It's not the case that we can be assured that everybody is going to be feeling exactly the same emotion at the same time. That's probably very unusual, even in an excited crowd or a good ritual that goes well. There are going to be a few people who are worried about what happens next and how they can make things even better. So the crowd is never unanimous, right? But it can be shared.
When you take a concept like, it seems to me like if you take a concept like anger, okay, and you say, this is an angry crowd. Now, it seems to me it's just like, that's what I'm saying, it's like Durkheim's analysis of suicide. You can still say that anger is a collective emotion and still have an individualist, which shows that anger is not a uniform thing, that there are a multiplicity of ways of being angry. And so you can show that each individual is angry in their own way. This does not negate the fact that the crowd is angry.
Yeah. Well, but I think there will be individuals in even the angriest crowd that aren't especially angry, right? That are puzzled or afraid or worried. I mean, it's maybe the crowd is a misleading. Suppose instead of crowd, we wanted to say the nation is angry. Now there it becomes more obvious that that's metaphorical, right? But I think to say that the crowd is angry is also metaphorical. What I'm happy to say is most of the members of that crowd look angry. And I'm willing to say if they look angry, they probably are angry. But I still would not say the crowd is angry. We can point to all sorts of mechanisms that put pressure on or trigger emotions in all the members of that crowd at the same time. And that, so we can explain why most of them would be angry, or maybe even you'd find a crowd where they're all angry. But I think we need to understand those mechanisms by which all the individuals came to be angry, rather than somehow talking about the crowd as being angry.
The crowd is angry. It's not the same as they are all angry.
Right. No, I know. Yeah,
That is the whole point.
This is what you say.
Yeah. No, I know.
Yeah.
Where does group identification come into the whole model? Okay, for example, in Tunisia, as you pointed out, like after the Bouazizi incident, it became a symbol where everyone was encouraged to go out like and protest and do everything. But for example, here in Lebanon, whatever, like let's say the same thing happened and someone just went out and self-immolation occurred, the same thing is not going to happen because of the sectarian divide we have in the country. So whatever emotion one individual is going to have and whatever symbol it's going to give, it's not going to apply here in the same way unless everyone is going to identify as a Lebanese identity. So we're not going to have a protest here, even with the emotion. So where does group identification come into like the description and everything you gave?
That's a good question, because I think it's really one of our fundamental sets of emotions that we have is these identifications with larger groups. We have some sense of loyalty, love of the group. Collective identity used to be understood really as a kind of drawing of borders in this very cognitive way. Well, there's us and there's them, and maybe there's somebody else too, and sort of like we sat down with a piece of paper and drew lines. But in fact, collective identity, if it means anything, it means that when a member of my group is insulted for being a member of the group, I feel ashamed. When something good happens to the group, I feel good, I feel proud. I get angry based on what happens to the group. So I think these are very important. And people had to work. Presumably, people had to work in Tunisia to get people to think of Bouazizi's action as about Tunisia, not about him as a fruit peddler, basically, right? So he had to become a symbol of the whole country, and that happened, I think, as they could frame the government, feel about the government as insensitive and distant, and he's a good symbol that captures that, right? So a lot of work has to go on to make a particular instance a symbol of the group and its welfare. But the group's welfare is crucial to our emotional state, and so we feel better or worse depending on how our group is doing. I think it's these dynamics of pride and shame and humiliation are really important, even if the group is small. And it's the same. If it could be our nation that we identify with, it could be our religion that we identify with. It can break down. It can just be our family, right? And that's a small could be a very small collective, but we still identify with them, feel in certain ways. And these are emotions. It's just that these are emotions that tend to have a certain permanence, duration to them, and they then are the background for other shorter-term emotions, right? We feel humiliated or we feel angry because we have this group identity, right? So there are emotions within the emotions, in a way, short-run and long-run emotions. But those are really important. Those are crucial ones, I would say.
I think we've reached a time where I would like to really, on behalf of all of you, thank Professor Jasper for a very, very, to me, it's been a riveting and a profound lecture, but it's also, I'm reluctant now to even ask the question, what am I doing, when I look at the intensity of violence, and in Lebanon, of course, and how just the raw emotion has not allowed people to say, look, we've had enough, and how groups develop the resilience to sanitize violence is an aspect that has, influenced my thinking a lot about what's happening. But in the case of Bani Azizi, it's who was telling us here that apparently it wasn't a woman who slapped him.
Oh, yeah.
He did not actually slap him.
Well,
He hated him, that's all.
and already the family are so he has been taken over, as an icon, and what's next? Really, I don't know. But really, thank you, James, for a very, very, very informed and informative lecture.